As the night moves slowly and the air feels like a thin blanket resting gently on the skin of a tired human being, it may help you to soften your breath and allow yourself to settle into a calmer rhythm while preparing for a long journey. Shaped by history, curiosity, and the darker corners of knowledge that have never been fully understood by anyone, not even by those who believe themselves the wisest. In this quiet moment, you do not need to take any action. Simply lie down or sit in a comfortable position. Feel your body gradually releasing the tension it carried through the day. And let your mind drift into a safe space, a silent space without demands or judgments. Imagine a soft light moving from a distance, not blinding yet bright enough to guide your attention toward a story that will open itself slowly, like the gentle unfolding of an old notebook touched by the night breeze. Within that glow lies an invitation to begin a long journey filled with curiosity yet wrapped in stillness. A journey that will lead you through corridors of time to an era when scientists and observers who believed they had mastered the laws of nature were in fact standing at the edge of a danger they did not fully recognize. Before we move into the historical parts and the real events, let this calm atmosphere settle around you. Picture a quiet laboratory table reflecting the steady white light, neither too bright nor too dim, a kind of constancy that resembles an old library late at night. Take a slow breath and let your thoughts merge with that image. The world outside is irrelevant now. Let it continue turning without your involvement. As you listen to this long narrative, you may allow your eyelids to feel heavy, and if you wish to close your eyes, you may do so. Because the story does not require your vision, only your gentle attention flowing without effort. We will speak of a small core that glowed an object that might have looked like an ordinary piece of metal to some, yet to history became a symbol of the meeting between human overconfidence and the unyielding forces of nature. But before that, calm your breathing and allow your mind to flatten like the surface of a still lake untouched by wind. In this softness, I invite you to walk within a story that moves slowly. A story that will stretch for hours with a rhythm that supports your rest. There is nothing you must understand perfectly, no answer you must seek, for this tale stands between certainty and unknowing. Between what was recorded and what was never fully discovered. You only need to listen and let your curiosity remain gentle like a shadow resting on a wall after a lamp has been turned off. This story begins with an object never meant to be frightening, yet eventually known as something that seemed almost alive. In this quiet opening, imagine yourself inside a large, empty room where only the gentle echo of a voice remains, carrying a calmness that gradually spreads through your body. There are no alarms, no danger, only a long tale meant to accompany you as you drift into sleep and allow the mystery to remain unresolved. So rest now. Feel your body grow lighter and let the night hold you while the story flows for hours. In the early years moving toward the middle of the 20th century, when the world had just emerged from a war that shook nearly every structure of human civilization, there was an atmosphere that could not be described with a single word. On one side, people celebrated the immense relief that the conflict had ended. Yet on the other side, there was a tension quietly growing from the awareness that humanity had now touched something never touched before. something that opened a doorway into a force not even the researchers fully understood. It was a period not far removed from the moment when the blue glow born from careless handling of a metal sphere would claim to lives and leave a long shadow in the history of nuclear physics. But before that tragedy entered collective memory, there was a silent era in Los Alamos, a location far from crowded cities positioned on a high plateau that looked harmless to anyone, unaware of what was unfolding behind its walls. Los Alamos was not merely a laboratory, but a small world separated from the rest of humanity, a place where scientists, technicians, and military personnel worked under a pressure that was rarely spoken out loud, a pressure to find answers while also keeping every detail hidden. Here, unusual experiments were carried out on small objects that appeared still yet contained potential energy, beyond the comprehension of ordinary imagination. At that time, the air around the facility often felt heavy, although no loud noises or suspicious movements occurred. Workers walked through long corridors with steps that seemed almost synchronized, not hurried, yet not relaxed, as though they understood that time moved differently here, slower, but denser, filled with consequences difficult to foresee. Those years were marked not only by discovery, but also by quiet anxiety, the kind that comes from knowing that every person who touched an object containing plutonium or uranium was pushing a boundary never tested before. No one truly knew how safe anything was, and no certainty existed that the numbers or formulas written one day would remain valid the next. In the silence, scientists left small notes on their desks, written in precise handwriting, filled with figures and calculations that needed reviewing, and on certain nights, some of them stayed longer than required, just to ensure that an earlier experiment had not left behind an unseen danger. It was a time suspended between confidence and doubt, between triumph and fear, and within that space, a small core slowly took shape. Los Alamos became a witness to the blend of human brilliance and human carelessness, a place where scientific ambition overlapped with moral boundaries still unclear. No one imagined that an object the size of a clenched fist would eventually become an icon of catastrophe, a placed commonplace. My life / my lies, my lies, my life. My lies, my lies, my life. My / praises, Kaizide, it be alive. My slide. To me, by we iv, by lie it is. I was a lie, it is a why it is. To go a lie, it is it is. It is it it's a slay, it's sit it a bit, it really took it to bait, sit it I to sip kissed, look missed week, it is the thick, didn't look to the best to sick, bent a map, Muth all was upon a pallet who I'm old. This was so danger born not from malice, but from the belief that humans had mastered something they never truly controlled. Yet before all of that occurred, the place remained a quiet world, filled with people working in silence, recording, measuring, calculating, and hoping that everything they did would lead toward a future beneficial to a world still recovering from war. During those years, the mystery began to take form, and no one realized they were standing at the beginning of a story that would later be remembered as a warning that human curiosity always brings both illumination and darkness. In the years that followed the end of the war, Los Alamos never truly returned to being a peaceful place because while the outside world attempted to rebuild daily life with a more optimistic rhythm, the laboratory on the high plateau continued to move toward territories that grew deeper and more complex. The scientists working there carried a dual feeling they rarely voiced. On one side, they believed that the knowledge they pursued could lead the world toward a safer future. Yet on the other side, a quiet fear grew whenever they realized that every miscalculation and every overly bold experiment could turn the facility into the center of a disaster beyond the imagination of anyone who did not understand the nature of the material they handled. During this era, the atom was no longer an abstract idea found in theoretical books, but a physical reality in front of them. Something they could measure, separate, combine, or push toward a critical point no one wished to reach. Young researchers often fell silent when watching the senior scientists work without raising their voices, as if every motion of the hand and every instrument placement required full awareness. That the room they stood in offered no second chances in the event of even the smallest mistake. The workrooms of Los Alamos carried an atmosphere unlike any other. Not only the smell of metal, oil, and coolant, but a quietness that clung to every surface like a thin, invisible fog. Each workstation was covered with circular diagrams, curvature graphs, equations, describing critical mass notes on neutron behavior, and tables filled with numbers that required daily verification, because no one dared risk an inaccuracy that could lead to a reaction too quick or too strong. In multiple rooms stood steel containers that appeared harmless to anyone unfamiliar with their purpose. Yet to those who worked there, they represented the line between breakthrough and catastrophe. No one took the idea of critical mass lightly because the concept was not merely numerical, but a boundary between passive matter and a disaster that could unfold in moments. In this environment, a particular core began to draw attention. It was not the only core under study, but it slowly gained its own identity among the researchers because of its complicated behavior, its unpredictability, and its tendency to deliver inconsistent results even under stable procedures. Officially, it carried a technical name, but quietly among experienced technicians, it began to be described as something with a personality. As though the small metal sphere responded differently depending on who approached it or how its tools were arranged. Within restricted notes were warnings that during near-critical experiments, the core sometimes reacted more quickly than prediction models indicated. Senior physicists emphasized maintaining distance, avoiding unnecessary neutron reflectors, and refraining from sudden changes to equipment configuration. Yet those who spent long hours in the room knew that theory only offered a broad outline, while practical work revealed small peculiarities unrecorded in any textbook. One quiet afternoon, when sunlight was muted behind thin clouds, several researchers gathered to repeat various neutron measurements. They rotated positions, verified the instruments, monitored temperature stability, and recorded the subtle fluctuations that appeared whenever the reflector position shifted even slightly. The experiments were always carried out in near silence, as though they feared waking something that should not be disturbed. Metal instruments reflected dim light, and the quiet room was interrupted only by the occasional clicking of neutron counters. Even small vibrations from the concrete floor made the researchers pause to ensure that every change came from the core itself and not from outside interference. They all knew the core was not alive, yet its behavior felt like an entity waiting for an unnoticed mistake. Time moved slowly in that room, and the daily reports they compiled often described patterns that shifted unpredictably. Some days reactivity climbed without apparent cause, then declined again like a small tide ignoring the direction of wind. On other days, the neutron response remained stable, yet carried an impression that made researchers frown, as though witnessing something just beyond comprehension. Though the work was entirely scientific, moments appeared when the boundary between physical explanation and human intuition became thin. As if the core held a nature that resisted full understanding. Within this quiet tension, Los Alamos slowly became not only a research center, but a place where humans learned that confidence could lead them dangerously close to forces that had never asked to be controlled. And amid all that caution, the small core that would one day be remembered for its deadly reputation waited for the moment when it would finally show how little separated scientific precision from the danger hidden behind a blue glow. In the year when technicians and physicists began to realize their experiments were no longer entirely within the realm of safety, Los Alamos was often covered by a thin morning fog that lingered until midday. The air hovering above the facility felt heavier than usual, as though carrying something not fully explained by the high plateau environment. Workers from various buildings noted that their footsteps in the morning echoed faintly, even though the ground had not changed in years. Some believed the echo was merely an acoustic effect from concrete halls filled with heavy machinery. But others sensed that the place was developing a new kind of silence, different from the wartime quiet that once dominated the laboratories. It was not an empty silence, but one filled with something waiting, something held within the metallic objects stored in the experiment rooms like a breath that had not yet been released. During this period, scientists often recorded small surges in neutron activity across multiple test chambers, even after recalibrating the instruments many times. These deviations were not considered serious. Yet there was something about the pattern that felt too deliberate and too consistent to be dismissed as chance. In one of the more secluded workspaces, a large board was used to record every minor fluctuation observed in their experiments. Each figure was compared with previous days to identify any tendencies that required caution. The researchers conducted their work with a precision that resembled ritual, checking reactivity levels, recalculating reflector measurements, and ensuring that room temperature remained stable to avoid adding new variables. But despite these precautions, small changes continued to appear, such as slightly faster neutron responses or spontaneous spikes that vanished before being captured properly. There was a recurring note in unofficial archives describing how several researchers felt that the objects in the experiment room seemed to observe them. The impression was unscientific, yet mentioned often enough to become a quiet secret among those who spent long hours inside. The atmosphere changed slowly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a room adjusting to the presence of something unseen. Some attributed it to fatigue, while others felt the space itself had developed a rhythm independent of temperature or machinery. Each step generated a faint vibration, as though the floor remembered every adjustment made within it. On a particular afternoon with a softer breeze than usual, the pale light reflecting off a steel table fell directly onto a secure container. It held a metal core that had not yet earned its notorious reputation, yet technicians already understood that it rarely behaved consistently between similar trials. They monitored every shift with greater attention each day, discovering that the core resisted simple categorization. It did not behave like passive metal, but like a delicate balance responding to its environment. Subtle signs hinted that those who observed it long enough could almost sense when it was about to deviate from predicted behavior. This was when some physicists quietly began discussing anomalous behavior in certain materials, although such discussions lacked conclusions, since no one wanted to introduce ideas that could not be expressed mathematically. Still, everyone agreed that the core displayed heightened sensitivity to environmental change. Even moving an instrument a few centimeters could alter measurements. Many experiments were paused simply to recalibrate tools after slight vibrations from opening doors or footsteps disturbed the setup. Every small action seemed to influence the core as though it had an internal equilibrium prone to disruption. The chamber housing the core became the focus for weeks. Every day, researchers observed shifting reactivity patterns like an unpredictable rhythm forming, waves that seemed to seek their own structure. Some days, the core appeared calm, like it was asleep. Other days, it produced subtle oscillations that made researchers pause their schedules. They noted that the instability did not seem random, but instead a response to unknown conditions in the room. The atmosphere grew more cautious, not out of fear, but from the sense that the core held something not yet ready to be explained. That year, Los Alamos stood at the boundary between scientific certainty and an uncertainty, born from something too small to see, yet too powerful to ignore. The researchers arrived daily, carrying curiosity, but also the awareness that any experiment might open a door they were not prepared for. Meanwhile, the small core they studied continued its slow path toward the moment when it would reveal its true nature through a glow nobody ever wished to witness. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Los Alamos slowly shifted, though no official announcement ever explained the cause of this change. Researchers who once spoke in hurried tones now chose silence more often, as if every word leaving their mouths had to be inspected carefully so as not to disturb the fragile balance forming around the facility. In the cold, dim basement, the small metal core was kept inside a seemingly ordinary container, guarded by layers of procedures that made anyone entering the room breathe a little slower. Some notes mentioned that the room temperature occasionally felt warm all of a sudden, even though the thermometer showed no significant change, as if the small object borrowed a bit of energy from its surroundings just to remind everyone of its presence. Daily reports from technicians began to record minor phenomena that had no place in scientific context, such as a faint hum heard only when standing alone, or a thin shadow that seemed to shift at the edge of vision, though no source of light had changed. No one dared to conclude anything, but everyone sensed that the core was not simply an object bound by the laws of physics. It felt like a quiet knot linking the present to something larger, something never fully discussed, yet always present in the subtle tremor of the air whenever someone stood too close to it. Some senior scientists who rarely showed hesitation began holding their breaths while checking neutron activity reports, as though the numbers were not just measurements, but messages waiting to be understood and perhaps also warning. On certain nights, when the facility settled into silence and lights were extinguished except for a few guard stations, the place felt like an enormous waiting chamber, embracing secrets too heavy to be spoken. The walkway to the experimental building seemed longer, its floor releasing a muted echo. And the sky above the laboratory appeared slightly darker than other areas, as if thin shadows gathered there just to watch. No one truly knew whether these sensations came from the object as power, or from human anxiety sharpened by the pressure of their work. But one thing became clear. Los Alamos was no longer merely a research site, to become a stage where history held its breath, waiting for the moment the metal core would finally be touched, moved, or approached by a single small action that might alter the course of everything without ever returning to what once was. The next morning, the researchers entered the experimental building with more measured steps, as if the floor itself was testing each footfall before allowing them to approach the room where the core was kept. The sunlight that slipped through the narrow window appeared as a pale streak reluctant to touch the metal equipment inside, and every reflection on the steel surfaces seemed to move more slowly than usual, as if the light itself was being urged to remain calm. At the center of the room, the plutonium core that would later be known as the demon core rested quietly, though its stillness carried the sense of something waiting with deliberate patience. The technicians performing routine inspections moved around the experiment table with caution not derived from physical fear, but from the awareness that they were standing near something that held both possibilities, at once stability and the chain reaction that could arise from a single mistake. They recorded radiation readings with the same procedures they had followed for weeks, yet several noted privately that their instruments felt more sensitive than usual, as if the air around the core filled the space with a faint vibration no device could register. In the corner, a physicist sat observing the patterns of his colleagues' movements, as if attempting to understand how the human body instinctively adjusted itself in the presence of an unmoving object. He noted that everyone lowered their voice without being told, and no one tapped the table or dropped tools, as though any sudden sound could provoke an unwanted consequence. When one technician lifted the shielding to check the core surface, a faint blue glow appeared for a moment before fading like a short breath pressed down by the room itself. They did not mention this phenomenon in official reports because no scientific basis could explain it. Yet many felt it without question. Afterward, the day proceeded as usual, but the rhythm of their routine shifted gradually. Those who normally moved quickly took more time to ensure each step aligned precisely with protocol. There were quiet moments when someone paused and closed their eyes, not from fatigue, but to sense whether the room altered subtly whenever they approached or stepped back from the core. Outside the building, the morning wind moved gently through the surrounding pines. Yet those walking toward the laboratory noticed that the breeze did not seem to touch them directly, as if the environment itself kept a respectful distance. It did not create fear or heightened alertness, but an unusual calmness, like entering a sacred space guarded by something unseen. Many began to recognize that the core, though merely a piece of metal made from isotopes, possessed a presence that influenced how people moved, breathed, and paid attention. It marked the room in its own way, creating an area where time seemed slightly slower, thoughts clearer yet heavier, and every sound quieter in acknowledgement of something unspoken. They did not know whether this influence came from unmeasured radiation or from human awareness sharpened by the invisible threat, but all agreed the room was no longer ordinary. It had become a place where the line between science and intuition blurred, where the existence of the core forced everyone to listen to what could not be heard, observe what did not move, and accept that some things appearing still were in fact watching each step with meticulous attention. At midday, as the slow light settled over the laboratory complex, the researchers continued their endless sequence of inspections, as though every procedure only answered half the questions raised by the presence of the core. Light coming through the small ceiling vents fell onto the steel table in an uneven manner, as if a thin layer in the air was deflecting photons before they touched the metal surface. Some technicians noticed that reflections near the core appeared softer, not dim, but muted in a way that reminded them of water lying beneath a gentle canopy of trees. They did not file this as an official observation. Yet quiet whispers about unexplained optical changes passed between them during shift changes. Near the main table, a technician measured the distance between two reflector components intended for an upcoming experiment. The task was simple, yet he carried it out with prolonged silence, as if the measuring tool could warn him faster than any alarm. He occasionally glanced toward the exposed core, and each time he did, he sensed the space around the object shift slightly, as if a subtle wave moved outward from its metallic center. The wave made no sound, caused no measurable change, yet had a way of making people stand straighter and breathe more quietly. Across the room, a theoretical physicist recorded the positions of equipment arranged earlier that morning. He noticed that a few cables, which normally hung straight, now shifted at gentle angles. Not pulled or fallen, but tilted, as if influenced by an unidentified field. He found no signs of electromagnetic interference. So he wrote a brief note suggesting static charge variation due to temperature. But he knew the explanation was only partially true, perhaps barely so, because the effect appeared only near the core's table and nowhere else. Two other researchers recalculated reactivity estimates and potential neutron flux increases for scenarios discussed over the past month. They reviewed graphs that appeared normal throughout the morning, yet they agreed normal was a difficult word to use regarding this core. They paused several times, not due to mathematical difficulty, but because of the unease that rose whenever they mentioned numbers dangerously close to criticality. It felt as though speaking the numbers might call forth something unwelcome. They continued in silence. At the equipment storage area, a technician entering for the noon shift sensed a very subtle change in the air. It carried a faint scent, neither chemical nor metallic, but like the smell of a sealed room left untouched for too long. He exhaled softly and noticed that his breath did not echo as usual. The room did not absorb the sound, but seemed to hold it briefly before releasing it in a slower rhythm. He wrote nothing, but hesitated a moment before moving deeper into the lab, as though waiting for permission from something unseen. When the researchers gathered around a schematic 3 meters from the core, they noticed the light above the table shifting subtly with the movement of their hands. It did not flicker or change intensity. Instead, its edges curved gently, as if influenced by a small gravitational pull they could not perceive. They fell silent for a moment, staring at the table, yet no one voiced any thought. At midday break, the building grew quieter. The hum of the cooling system blended with a low vibration of uncertain origin. Even away from the core, some researchers felt as though they carried its presence with them. The break room was only a few meters from the main lab, yet its atmosphere remained different, as if the walls were not enough to contain the influence of the object they studied. While drinking cooling coffee, a senior physicist murmured that the core seemed to be remembering something. He did not present it as theory, only as a feeling. No one argued. They all understood the core had emerged from a project built too quickly, too confidently, with too much faith in human control. And now, amid the quiet routine, they sensed the object might carry traces of every hand that shaped it, every decision made, and every consequence waiting at the boundary between observation and destruction. In the gentle silence of the next morning, the narrow corridor of the research facility appeared like an endless tunnel stretching slowly between the soft hum of measuring instruments that repeated the same rhythmic whisper each day, as if everything within the building was breathing with patient stillness, and the researchers who walked down the hallway carried small notebooks, while occasionally glancing toward the monitoring room separated by thick, pale glass. Behind that glass, the demon core rested quietly on its metal platform, emitting no light, showing no sign of life, appearing merely as a piece of ordinary metal to anyone who did not understand the potential hidden within its silence. And many people at the time believed that as long as the object was not moved or touched, it had no chance to stir fear or danger. Yet beneath that calm, the technicians who visited the room daily knew something different, for they had seen subtle patterns appear on the neutron counters whenever a metal object near the core was shifted by a distance so small that the human eye could hardly perceive it, and this made several of them wonder why such a simple piece of tease metal could react so sensitively to the slightest change in space. Every time they passed that room, they felt a quiet, emotional tremor that no one ever voiced, a kind of respect, born not from admiration, but from knowing that the silent object could act with a force beyond ordinary human understanding. In the administrative room on the far east side of the facility, an elderly archivist who had worked there for more than a decade recorded every detail conveyed by the researchers with neat but slightly trembling handwriting, as if wanting to ensure that not even the smallest detail slipped through the cracks. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit break room filled with the soft glow of yellowish lights, the scientists often sat quietly with cups of cooling coffee, watching the steam rise slowly, like wandering fog drifting among trees. They spoke softly of calculations, energy shifts, critical thresholds, and how the next experiment should be approached. But these conversations often stopped before reaching clear conclusions because none of them felt entirely comfortable imagining what might happen if even the smallest mistake was made. Although safety protocols were reviewed each morning, and although everyone had memorized the rules, a faint layer of doubt floated like thin dust in the air, because some things could never be fully predicted. In the stillness that hung like unmoving cloth, a few researchers began to notice how the air around the core felt heavier, even though no scientific evidence confirmed such a sensation. They observed small objects such as paper clips, screwdrivers, and wrenches reflecting light differently when placed too close to the core. Though such phenomena were never recorded in official documents, there were also unofficial stories of a technician feeling the floor tremble one day, despite no heavy machinery being used. That tale was never discussed openly, yet it quietly spread, adding another piece to the growing collection of unanswered mysteries. That afternoon, as the sunlight softened and filled the eastern wing with warm copper tones, a young researcher stood before the monitoring glass for a long time, staring at the core with a distant look, as if trying to understand something beyond logic or formulas. He felt a subtle pull urging him to observe the core more closely. not from bravery, but from an inherently human curiosity that could never be fully controlled. He remained there until the warm afternoon light faded, leaving only the pale glow of white lamps that made the metal object appear even more mysterious. Eventually, he left, but the image of the core lingered in his mind like a question that refused to be answered, and he did not yet know that such curiosity would one day lead someone into a danger far beyond imagination. The following day, the atmosphere in the facility felt slightly different, even though no one could point to a single visible change, as if the air in the corridors and research rooms had grown thicker and filled with an indescribable impression. The researchers walked more slowly than usual, not out of fatigue, but because each step carried a caution that had never truly faded since the demon core was placed in its chamber. That morning, the hum of the cooling fans sounded sharper, echoing softly against the metal walls, and tiny reflections from indicator lights made the metal tables shimmer like rippling water beneath the sun. In the central data room, several technicians examined the previous day's readings, trying to find patterns that might have been missed. They noticed a nearly invisible spike in the graphs, a spike that appeared at the same time the young researcher had stood for so long behind the observation glass the day before. None of them suggested the events were connected, for there was no evidence to support such a link. Yet they quietly stored the thought like an unspoken mental note. In another room filled with the scent of paper and ink, the elderly archivist wrote the morning report once again, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from an ever-present sense of responsibility. He had witnessed how 2 previous incidents shook the Laborian years not too distant, and though he had not been in the room when they happened. He had heard from direct witnesses about how the blue flash appeared, moving like the breath of an unseen creature. A light that came quickly and silently, but left marks that never faded from the memory of anyone who saw it. In the narrow recreation corner, a senior physicist sat spinning a pencil between his fingers, lost in thought as he observed small patterns formed on the floor by the interplay of light and the shadows of neatly arranged equipment. He considered theories about why the core behaves so sensitively despite not being near criticality. He weighed the possibility of imperfections in the metal structure or environmental resonances never accounted for. But the more he thought, the more he realized that perhaps some things could not be entirely explained by theory. Not because the theories were wrong, but because nature itself often offered subtle surprises never written in manuals. Meanwhile, in a small ventilation room, rarely visited, a young technician noticed that one of the metal pipes above the air duct looked different that day, as if its surface reflected light in a duller way. He knew it likely had no connection to the core in the other room, yet he sensed it as a small sign of something he could not understand. He stared at the pipe for a long moment before resuming his work, though the image lingered in his mind as he walked away. In the main room, several researchers began rearranging equipment for the next experiment. They spoke softly, almost whispering, as though louder voices could disturb the delicate balance in the chamber. They moved metal tubes, checked neutron reflectors, and ensured precise distances between components. Their movements resembled a slow dance with its own rhythm, as if the room itself was watching to ensure no mistake occurred. At that moment, a gentle and meticulous female researcher stood near a small window overlooking distant mountains to the west. She observed the golden morning light creeping across the peaks, then turned back to the research chamber. In her quiet heart, she felt something she could not explain, a kind of intuition she refused to label as anxiety. She simply noticed that everything in the room felt as though it was waiting. It was unclear what it was waiting for, but every tool, every table, every instruction sheet, even the air flowing through the vents felt as if holding its breath. For reasons she did not fully understand, she sensed the day would differ from all others. She did not know whether the difference would bring good or ill, only that something was moving slowly beneath the neat and quiet order of the facility. She gazed at the demon core for a few final seconds before returning to her tasks. And in that moment, she felt that the small metal sphere was watching the world in a way no human could comprehend. At midday, the facility felt even quieter, as if the entire building held its own breath to watch the small metal core resting inside the experiment chamber. Sunlight passing through the narrow hallway windows shifted from soft yellow to pale white as though stripped of warmth while moving through unusually dense air. Some researchers noticed the change as they walked toward the control room. But they said nothing because they were accustomed to accepting that small details in the facility often carried meanings not immediately explainable. Their footsteps, which normally echoed, now sounded softer, as if the floor absorbed each vibration to avoid disturbing the object in the main chamber. Along the walls, safety posters trembled slightly from airflow, but the tremor followed a rhythm unmatched by any machine operating in the building. Two young technicians stood observing the tremors, sensing a pulse behind them, even though they did not know what message was being conveyed. In the control room, several screens displayed blue graphs showing the core stability. The lines appeared normal, yet carried tiny ripples that appeared unpredictably. The ripples were too small to signal danger, yet large enough to make the senior physicists lean closer. They zoomed in, observing how the ripples seemed to originate from an unseen center. They suspected temperature shifts or reflected radiation, but no theory fit well. Every explanation felt too simple for the phenomenon. An elderly physicist closed his eyes and inhaled slowly. Having worked with sensitive materials for too many years, he knew that data sometimes spoke in a language not yet understood by science. In the experiment room, the metal core remained still, reflecting ceiling lights in faint circular patterns that appeared to shift even though the lights had not changed. A female researcher observed the reflection and noted the slightly bluer tone. She knew that small changes often preceded larger ones, but avoided writing any predictions. She recorded only angles, intensities, and durations because she understood that small notes could one day become crucial foundations for understanding. Around the core, instruments were arranged precisely. Neutron reflectors were positioned at exact distances to maintain safe conditions. The metal objects in the room cast thin, drifting shadows following the airflow. A technician specializing in optics noticed some shadows formed from angles that lacked a direct light source. He considered investigating further, but decided to wait, unwilling to disturb the delicate structure of the room for something that might simply be an illusion. In the administrative room, a young researcher typed a report detailing the history of experiments involving the core. Several times he paused, sensing shadows shifting at the edge of his vision. Each time he looked, nothing had changed, yet the feeling persisted. He returned to writing about two major incidents from past years. How vivid blue light had appeared as if born from within the metal, and how silence afterward filled the facility like a weight. Those events had changed the laboratory both procedurally and emotionally. Every person carried their own quiet, as if the blue flash had left a trace that could not be seen but always remained. Outside the facility, the afternoon breeze moved through the trees lining the fence. Leaves shifted gently, as though unaware of the tension within the walls. The sky was clear, and sunlight touched the building fully. Yet the guards at the gate felt a faint pressure in the air each time they faced the main structure. A thin sensation against the skin they could not explain. They never asked questions, knowing their role was not to understand, but to guard. And when midday arrived, the stillness within the facility deepened. No alarms, no warnings, no unusual sounds. Only an orderliness so complete it felt unnatural, as if everything awaited something stirring beneath the polished surface of the small metal sphere. The researchers did not yet know that the day would bring the core closer to revealing a side they had only read about in records and stories from those who once stood too near. This paragraph moves slowly, like mist drifting through the quiet laboratory corridor, creating an atmosphere that seems to hover between the world of scientific calculation and the world of whispers that never fully explain themselves. And on that night, the laboratory appeared quieter than usual, as though every object inside was holding its breath, waiting for something that had no clear time of arrival while maintaining its familiar routines that always had the possibility of showing a new shadow at the edge of someone's sight if they looked too long. On the cold steel table, the small metal core remained at the center of the room, reflecting the pale yellow laboratory. Light in a way that was not bright, but still captivating as though it possessed a thin layer of glow, not created by simple reflection, but by something deeper, more alive, more aware. Several researchers passing by often felt as if the object was looking back at them, even though they knew well that lifeless objects cannot possess intention yet, in a place filled with a long history of experiments that often did not end entirely as planned. Imaginations tended to wander slightly more freely, and no one ever blamed anyone who felt a bit uneasy when seeing the core from certain angles, especially when the lights flickered slightly due to unstable electricity like that night. On the left side of the room stood a shelf containing stacks of experiment journals that were rarely touched because most researchers had memorized the usual procedures required to keep the core within safe limits, although safe itself was a flexible concept changing with context, intent, and the demands of experiments that sometimes pushed humans to walk slightly closer to danger they already understood. Well, among the dusty papers were also unfinished notes left by someone known now only by a name in an official report, someone who once commented that the core possessed a silence unlike any other object, a silence that made it feel like a creature sleeping, perhaps waiting or perhaps avoiding something. When footsteps echoed down the hallway toward the main laboratory, their sound stretched longer than usual, as if the corridor wished to extend the sound. so it might reach the core and disturb it from within. Yet when the door opened, only one researcher entered, carrying a clipboard and notes to be updated, something that needed to be done every hour to ensure no small deviation grew into a larger one. The researcher looked at the core the way a nurse looks at a sleeping patient. And in that glance was a mix of respect, caution, and a quiet admiration that no one attempted to place into words. As the researcher wrote down the room temperature, humidity, and radiation levels, which remained within normal values, although normal was relative in the context of such an object, he saw his own reflection on the metal surface slightly distorted, as though the core had developed the river. Stone habit of showing faces imperfectly, never fully clear, never fully gone. He noticed the faint movement of the gauge needle shifting almost imperceptibly, resembling the slow pulse of something taking a long breath before again falling still. In the corner, the ventilation fan spun with its rhythmic, soft hum, sounding like a large clock holding the pace of the research steady, though. That night, its tone seemed somewhat different, perhaps due to exhaustion, or perhaps because the room itself carried something that would reveal its meaning only days or weeks later. Yet no one spoke of such things aloud, because laboratories valued data, not intuition. Still, intuition appeared shaped in the form of a quietness, slightly too quiet, as though the room awaited a small decision that would shift history slightly left or right. When the researcher finally closed the clipboard and returned it to the shelf, he looked once more at the core, this time longer, as if wishing to confirm that the unusual quiet was not a sign but simply part of the long routine of the laboratory. Yet as he turned away, he saw a brief shimmer move across the surface like moonlit water too. Faint to be a warning, to clear to ignore, and he stood still a little longer before deciding it was merely fatigue playing tricks on his eyes. Outside the room, the night air slipped through the vents, causing a subtle tremor. Around the steel table, like a quiet breath without a source, yet the laboratory remained orderly and silent, filled with the presence of a small, harmless-looking object whose aura continued to hold the attention of anyone who lingered too close for too long. And within that silence, no answer appeared. Only a calm that felt strangely soothing while hiding a deepening mystery with each passing night. On the following night, the laboratory returned to its stillness, like a large stone resting at the bottom of a river, unmoving yet giving the impression that something within that silence continued to flow slowly, like an unseen current waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The air felt slightly colder than the night before, though the thermometer showed nearly the same number, and several researchers entering for routine checks admitted they sensed a subtle shift difficult to explain, as though the room were holding something it did not wish to release, and the shift was not strong enough to record in an official report, yet noticeable enough to make someone pause before stepping further. The metal core remained in its place, yet its reflection looked different that night, showing lines of light that moved more slowly, as though the surface were breathing in a rhythm unseen, but felt like the long breath of an ancient creature trapped between two worlds, the world that can be fully explained and the world that can only be guessed. On the east shelf, old radiation experiment notes still lay undisturbed, and their pages fluttered slightly with the ventilation breeze, producing sounds like someone turning the pages of an old library book. Many of the notes were written by researchers no longer present, leaving behind handwriting that was not neat but full of determination to understand something that perhaps could never be fully understood. The notes sat quietly like witnesses, holding the stories of human attempts to restrain the blue light that could appear if certain boundaries were crossed, though no one knew which boundary was the most dangerous or whether those boundaries shifted like shorelines shaped by the tide. A young researcher entered with slow steps, carrying fresh documentation for the night, and his gaze immediately fell on the core, not because it was unfamiliar, but because each time someone looked at it, there was always something new, perceived by the human eye, something impossible to replicate in the same way. He approached calmly, sensing the atmosphere was heavier, not physically, but as though filled with thoughts avoiding definition. Turning on an auxiliary lamp, he examined the smooth metal surface and the light reflected in a curved ripple pattern, like water expanding from a center point, and he blinked twice to confirm whether fatigue was affecting his perception. While adjusting instruments, he heard a faint tapping sound, like glass being touched, though nothing in the room had moved. The sound appeared only once, like a brief whisper, and vanished. He glanced around, finding nothing but elongated shadows cast by the equipment shelves. The readings appeared stable, though a slight shift in radiation values caught his attention, not enough for an anomaly, but enough for someone observing carefully. The ceiling lights flickered with unstable electricity, producing waves of brightness, forming patterns that dissolved before becoming clear. He sensed an odd feeling, despite the unchanged temperature, as if the core were subtly observing, not as a living creature, but as an object, holding the memory of every experiment ever done around it. In the corner, the wall clock ticked slowly, like a distant pulse, counting time not in seconds, but in breaths, as if the laboratory followed a different rhythm than people. After finishing his notes, he moved to the opposite side of the table to observe the core from a new angle, and saw a thin line of light twisting one brief moment before disappearing like someone drawing back a curtain of illumination. When he stepped closer, nothing remained except the calm, metallic surface. As he turned to leave, he felt a soft air current moving from the direction of the core, though the ventilation was elsewhere. He stopped for a heartbeat, attempting to decide whether the sensation was real. Yet, like every night, no answers came, only the quiet returning to seal the room again, allowing everything to appear normal, although something faint continued to grow more noticeable with each passing day. Near midnight, when most people in the facility were asleep and only a few senior researchers remained in there, offices, the main laboratory once again revealed a quiet presence that never truly rested. Small lights on control panels glowed like faint stars guarding an artificial night sky, and the soft hum of the cooling system pulsed steadily with subtle pauses, as though adjusting itself to something unmeasurable. The hallway leading to the laboratory felt longer, though its size had not changed, and footsteps seemed quieter, as if the air absorbed sound in a way that made the walls feel attentive. Inside the laboratory, the metal core sat at the center of the steel table like an object waiting for its keeper to return. The reflective surface cast arcs of light toward the dim ceiling, creating shapes that resembled horizons rising on calm water. The room did not feel as though it sought attention, yet it constantly drew the eyes of anyone who passed by. At certain hours, it released a faint breath almost imperceptible to instruments, yet detectable to the human body. Like a soft pressure under the skin or a light pulse beneath the collarbone. Notes from the previous shift lay on a side table, with the top page documenting a minor shift in light reflection patterns. No major anomaly was recorded yet. The observer noted a brief curve traced across the surface, as if a thin line attempted to draw something before fading. The entry ended vaguely, as if the writer hesitated to finalize it. The temperature dropped slightly, similar to fog settling quietly into a valley. It was not cold enough to cause discomfort, but enough to lengthen each breath. A shadow beneath the table shifted faintly, as if following the rhythm of light, even though the light source had not moved. A low resonance filled the room like the distant echo of a deep well without beginning or end. A small monitor in the corner displayed a slow, stable graph, yet the line rose in an irregular, subtle pattern. It was too soft to be labeled an anomaly, but enough to suggest that something not fully visible was responding. Experienced researchers recognized that small fluctuations often served as the earliest warnings, though no one wanted to reach any premature conclusion that night. Around 2 o'clock, the door opened and a senior researcher entered carrying a thin folder. His steps slowed as he crossed the shadow of the table, though he could not explain why. Taking his seat, he examined the core and felt an odd calm, similar to sitting beside a deep lake on a windless night where reflections revealed only fragments of the unseen depths. Turning on a desk lamp, he observed a faint, slow-moving gleam across the surface for only a moment before it vanished. He documented the event without interpretation, knowing the core had displayed similar phenomena, but sensing something distinct that night. A gentle pressure grew around his temples as if the room were listening. It did not feel threatening, only ancient and patient. Moving to view the core from another angle, he noticed the lamplight widening as though expanding its own field. On the right side of the table, the air felt slightly warmer, as if the room held two subtle climates that should not have existed. At that moment, he understood something he had felt for weeks, that the core did not merely store energy, but mirrored the conditions around it. Not communication, but a quiet echo. A reflective map of the room's shifting state. And that night, the state was changing. As he left the room, loosened like a ribbon, uncoiling. The core remained completely still, yet he sensed something within it, refusing to fade. He turned off the lamp, returned the chair, and walked out with a steady step, as though the room had granted him permission to depart only for that night. Within the shadowed laboratory, whose silence was maintained as carefully as its instruments, the researchers began to recognize that every interaction with the core carried a new sense of awareness, as if the small object possessed its own way of reminding them where the boundary between control and human fragility truly existed. And that night, when the lights glowed dimly and the cooling system hummed like a long, measured breath, someone recorded that the faint blue shimmer had returned to the surface of the calm, rounded metal, a glow that did not flare suddenly, but instead grew slowly like a thin fog rising through darkness, making them wonder whether the object was merely a compressed assembly of atoms or the center of a phenomenon not yet fully understood. And as they stared at it without speaking much, they began to feel that everything in the room shifted according to a rhythm they could not quite define. the air becoming slightly warmer, footsteps sounding more distant, and their shadows stretching longer across the floor than usual. Then one of the scientists stepped closer and recorded a tiny shift on the measuring device. A spike so small it was nearly invisible, yet enough to ignite a quiet stream of unease. And in the midst of that silence arose an unspoken question: whether the core was simply responding to physical surroundings, or whether it was conveying something more subtle than an ordinary nuclear reaction. And as they observed it longer, a very soft sound appeared, like an electrical whisper or a delicate resonance traveling through the wires, causing some of them to turn even though they saw nothing that could have produced it. And the longer they stood encircling the object, the more they sensed that time around them was slowing down, as though the clock itself had adopted a new rhythm not aligned with mechanical ticks. And another researcher began to write down his own feelings for the first time in an experiment log, admitting that the presence of the core made him feel as though he was being watched by something without eyes, while others stared with a mixture of admiration and caution. Yet none stepped back, because curiosity had already sunk too deep to be abandoned. And the cold room now felt like the center of an ancient mystery disguised in modern technology. A paradox that made them wonder whether humanity truly understood what it had created, or whether they were repeating an old pattern where confidence always outruns comprehension. And the blue shimmer intensified briefly before softening again, like the fading pulse of a lamp running out of power, leaving behind a stillness more confusing than the glow itself, as if the core had just given an unclear warning that they could not decipher but would all remember from that night, making them realize that the story of this small core had not reached its peak, and still concealed layers waiting to be uncovered with greater courage and steadier calm. While outside the building, the night wind drifted past the trees, unaware that behind the cold laboratory walls, humans were standing dangerously close to something that might never have wished to be tamed at all. Inside the room, whose lighting was always kept between two quiet extremes, never too bright and never fully dark, the researchers once again gathered around the core with a feeling they struggled to describe, as if the atmosphere itself had grown heavier, yet remained strangely gentle. And on that night, they sensed that the aura rising from the plutonium metal moved like a wave that could not be fully seen, but could be felt, seeping into every corner of the laboratory, with a presence that made someone inhale more softly, as though any disturbance might cause an imbalance, while from one corner, a technician noted that the radiation scattered no longer followed the normal rising and falling movement they had observed on LOM. "I've served on Lawlsbreed," formed a slow, curved pulse, resembling the faint heartbeat of something that did not belong to the categories of lifeless objects or random physical behavior. And each time that curve rose a fraction, they felt a subtle vibration passing through the floor like a resonance with no clear direction, causing several of them to focus on a gentle hum emerging from the steel table, where the core rested, a hum that never became fully audible, yet still created a controlled tension in the mind of anyone who stood too close for too long. And as they observed more closely, the dim glow across the rounded surface shifted again into a slow, spreading light that moved with a rhythm more alive than any ordinary interaction of physics, which led one of the scientists to write a hypothesis that felt too imaginative for a laboratory notebook, yet he wrote it anyway because he knew that whatever they witnessed could no longer be described using conventional terminology. And he wrote that the core might not simply be an object holding energy within the structural limits of its atoms, but something different because the way it produced responses followed patterns more similar to the awareness of a being observing its surroundings with a steady intensity despite having no logical basis to consider it alive at all. And he read his note repeatedly while standing closest to the blue radiance that appeared through a faint seam on the metal surface that seemed to exhale light like a slow rising and falling breath. And another researcher standing half a meter behind him recorded that the instrument indicators now moved, like a line searching for a new balance point, but never finding it, making the room feel suspended between two states, one that belonged to the physics they had mastered for years, and another born from something they had never anticipated. Then one of them spoke softly, saying that perhaps the core was showing them its boundary, not as a threat, but as a consequence of something humans had created too quickly before understanding the full implications. And although the voice was low, everyone heard it, 'cause the silence made every breath echo. And after that, they returned to silence, directing their attention to the tiny shifts of light emerging now in a pulse that felt fully regular, making time in the room slow, as though each second stretched wide enough to hold anxiety and wonder at the same time. And as the pulse dimmed, then returned with slightly stronger intensity, they realized whatever was happening had begun forming a consistent pattern, one they might study. Yet they also understood that such knowledge might lead them toward risks they could never avoid because the core had grown into something larger than an experiment. It had become the center of a story they did not want to admit as a modern legend. A legend born from human hands, yet moving into directions impossible to predict. And on that night, when the final measurements were recorded and they prepared to leave, someone stared at the core longer than intended, as if trying to understand fully what he had witnessed. But eventually, he turned and followed the others out, leaving the core in a quiet that seemed to pulse again, as though waiting for the next chapter to reveal itself in a time that could never be entirely certain. The next morning arrived with an unhurried pace, bringing cold air that slipped through the window frame like a reminder that the world outside continued moving with the same rhythm, even though inside the building something far less explainable was unfolding. The sunlight that entered the laboratory never felt warm, and several researchers noted that the room where the core was stored always remained slightly colder than the surrounding rooms, even though the heating system was verified to be functioning normally. As they entered the room, the silence that had felt tense the night before had shifted into a flatter silence, a silence that seemed to wait for someone to write the next note on the half-filled clipboard. Some of them stood farther from the steel table where the core rested, as if unconsciously giving it more space, not out of fear, but because they sensed that the boundaries of the room, which once felt ordinary, had undergone a subtle change they could not describe. One researcher observed that the faint glow visible the night before was absent that morning, yet the sensation of presence remained fully intact, as though the light had simply withdrawn into the atoms to rest while waiting for a trigger of its own choosing. They moved slowly around the room, and every step sounded slightly louder, perhaps because of the cold floor, or perhaps because their minds were searching for something they did not yet understand. When one scientist placed a document on the side table, he noticed the paper was unusually light, so light that it shifted slightly when he brought his hand near its surface, even though there was no draft or airflow that could have caused the movement. He recorded the observation without forming a conclusion because he knew that every detail, no matter how small, needed to remain within the context of observation. Meanwhile, in another corner, a technician attempted to activate the radiation monitor, but its digital display flickered as though attempting to adjust to something unstable. After a few seconds, the device finally displayed numbers that moved with a slow, steady rhythm. That was not random, causing the technician to watch them longer than he meant to. The pattern seemed familiar, but not enough to be identified, like hearing footsteps on an upper floor when one knows no one is there. A senior scientist remarked that the pattern drifted like a breath being regulated, not by a human, but by something attempting to imitate human order without fully understanding it. He wrote long notes, most of which offered no conclusion because he understood that drawing conclusions too quickly would cause them to overlook subtler signs. As he approached the core, he noticed a faint reflection of his face on the metal surface. Yet the reflection appeared darker than the lighting of the room. He stared at it for a few seconds, trying to determine whether it was simply a lighting effect or whether something within the structure of the metal had begun to shift. Behind him, several researchers spoke in low voices, ensuring their conversation did not echo too sharply in the room because they felt that loud sounds might affect something within the core, even though that feeling was never fully expressed. Everyone moved carefully, as if occupying a space borrowed from something far larger than themselves. No one believed the situation was immediately dangerous, but they sensed they were approaching the boundary of their accumulated texture. Knowledge, a boundary they had never noticed until the core showed signs resembling an organic dynamic without ever resembling life in any form they understood. When the morning measurements were completed, a young researcher wrote a short note stating he felt core was observing them back not through eyes or consciousness, but through the responses they detected, though could not interpret. The note was only a single sentence written without planning, yet he felt compelled to write it as part of his observational discipline. The room remained quiet, and the researchers exited one by one, leaving the core in the morning light that never fully touched. It is as though a thin, invisible membrane separated it from the world, a membrane they could not see but could sense, gradually declaring its presence. Midday arrived with a change small enough to be overlooked, yet natural to be sensed by anyone who remained near the core long enough to notice that it now behaved in ways that no longer aligned with the idea of a simple object. The light in the research room appeared slightly dimmer, even though the lamps functioned normally, and several researchers checked the power system to ensure there were no disruptions. All instruments showed stable readings, suggesting the room itself was controlling the brightness it wished to accept. When a technician moved a metal chair toward the table, the scraping sound lingered longer than expected, as if the echo hesitated before fading. Small phenomena like these had repeated since morning, but no one labeled them as anomalies because each event stayed within boundaries too vague to define. Still, the researchers increasingly sensed that the core responded not only to physical interference, but also to human presence, as though it was attempting to read the patterns they unconsciously carried. As they prepared the noon measurements, a senior scientist noticed an analog gauge needle moving slowly but consistently, following an internal rhythm unrelated to heat or radiation. He watched 4 minutes, then wrote notes proposing possibilities such as micropressure changes or local electrical fluctuations. None of these theories had evidence, but they felt safer to record than admitting he sensed something closer to intention than mechanics. Meanwhile, a young researcher assigned to monitor the visual state of the core stopped mid-step as he felt himself walking into a thicker layer of air surrounding the object. The air looked still, yet felt denser, though thermometers showed no temperature change. The sensation resembled standing near a warm hearth without receiving any heat. He rubbed his arm, ensuring the sensation was not imagined, then recorded it as an unmeasurable perception. At that moment, the faint light that sometimes clung to the core returned not as a glow, but as a soft weaving that slowly traced the curvature of the metal. It did not shine outward, but adhered to the surface like a thin flowing film. When additional light was directed at the core, no reflection appeared. The light seemed to vanish, not absorbed entirely, but set aside as if stored. One observer at the far end of the room noted that artificial light dimmed faster near the core compared to identical sources placed elsewhere, and he hypothesized the core neutralized certain energies. The team wrote their notes without commentary, understanding that premature interpretation would distort the fragile accuracy of their observations. During the radiation assessment, digital readings displayed a faint, repeated pattern, but not organized enough to be called a cycle. The values rose and fell in narrow ranges, always returning to a central number, as if orbiting around a point it would never cross. The observer felt the core was adjusting itself to the instrument, not the other way around. He did not say it aloud, but wrote it as a tendency requiring future review. As he turned to consult a colleague, he noticed the room sound had changed, becoming more muted in a way unrelated to temperature. It felt as though the room was absorbing some of their vocal vibrations and releasing them slowly as barely audible echoes. At one moment, a technician seated near the table felt a delicate vibration along the metal legs. It was not mechanical, but pulsed, as if originating from the center and flowing outward before fading and returning in a rhythm not random. Placing his hand on the surface, he felt the wave like a signal trying to communicate through structure rather than sound. Some scientists approached, but only a few felt the vibration, indicating the phenomenon was selective. They speculated it might depend on posture or attention intensity, but could not prove it. They only understood the core was developing response patterns, resembling a system attempting to understand its surroundings. The day drifted toward afternoon without conclusions, though each minute seemed to add another layer of subtle evidence. The researchers spoke softly, not by instruction, but because the room seemed to guide them toward quietness. They sensed the core held energy, not passive nor fully active, like a being deciding whether to wake or wait. No one dared call it alive, but all now understood it was not fully still, and perhaps had never been still since its creation. They ended the session noting that the core behavior showed direction, but remained gentle, as if avoiding threat. As they left the room, One by one, they felt that whatever would come next would not arrive as a sudden change, but as a continuation of something. Long in motion, though no one could tell when it began or where its emerging patterns would lead. In the quiet return of night, when the laboratory dimmed under lights that felt older than the building itself, the researchers slowly realized that their routines had shifted without anyone noticing. There was a silent pause before anyone approached the core, a kind of ritual never taught yet automatically followed. They moved slower, watched longer, as if waiting for a signal that the day would remain safe. No one ever said it aloud, yet every step they took in that room carried a layer of caution, far more delicate than any safety protocol. They looked at the small metal sphere and felt something looking back, not with eyes, but with an inexplicable awareness. The presence it emitted was neither heat nor cold, but a soft pressure that made one breathe more calmly, as though urged to acknowledge boundaries that must not be crossed. Among stacks of testing documents was a small note written by a young technician whom few ever noticed. The note described how the room's light subtly changed each time the core was moved. Not dramatically and not brightly, only a thin shift in color that could not be explained by lamps or reflections. He wrote that the color felt like a whisper seen by the eyes instead of heard by the ears, a hue that revealed nothing yet made one feel observed from behind time itself. When the note was found weeks later, some researchers dismissed it, given the technical nature of their work, but a few withheld judgment, quietly acknowledging the possibility that humans might be dealing with something older than their theories could describe. The next night, as the air settled into a deeper stillness and the ticking of the wall clock became the only sound, the laboratory felt wrapped in gentle emptiness. No wind, no machinery, only a room holding its breath. In that stillness, the core seemed larger than its physical size, like a shadow expanding when eyes grow tired. Some researchers felt the same sensation, as if the room revolved around the core instead of the other way around. They did not voice it, since poetic descriptions in scientific environments were often dismissed as fatigue or imagination. Yet quietly, they admitted that a particular atmosphere arose each time night deepened. Not threatening, but urging softer speech and quieter footsteps. When a senior scientist attempted to record these impressions as notes on ambient changes and altered perception, he found that every word felt insufficient. He wrote of the light, of the pressure, of the silence that was unlike ordinary silence, yet everything still fell short. It was as though any attempt to describe the experience would always miss the essential part. Sense that the core was waiting patiently with no clear intent, simply existing like an object aware but not alive. And the researchers, without realizing it, waited alongside it night after night, guardians who never fully understood what they were guarding. The following night, when the air felt denser and the sky outside the laboratory window seemed to hold all sound within its darkness, the researchers returned to their work with a slow and cautious rhythm. The atmosphere carried something that could not be easily described, a blend of gentleness and faint alertness that made time seem to move differently when they stood near the core. No one understood why the feeling emerged, yet everyone sensed it in almost the same way. It felt as though the room listened to their footsteps and adjusted itself, giving space for every movement to be heard, even though no loud sound was made. In that stillness, the small core on the table appeared unchanged, yet at the same time it felt as though it's expanding, not physically, but in the way its presence filled the entire room with an awareness that could not be ignored. The researchers silently began to pay attention to something more intriguing than data or emission patterns. They noticed how their thoughts slowed down, yet became sharper, as though there was a pause between the urge to question and the desire to understand. Some of them noted in private journals that the silence around the core felt different from the natural quiet they usually experienced during late hours. The silence felt dense, encircling their bodies with an invisible layer that forced them to feel rather than think. As they stood watching the object, they realized there were no familiar small sounds. No rustling paper, no humming machinery, not even the slight metallic clicks of the table supports. It was as if the entire room decided to stop moving and focus solely on the small sphere. The core did not shine. Yet the researcher sensed a soft light that was invisible to the eye, but perceptible through intuition. That unseen glow seemed to shape a safe distance around the object, urging anyone who approached to slow their steps as though entering a sacred place. Among all these impressions, one curious detail surfaced. Whenever they tried to recall what it felt like to stand too close to the core, the memory seemed blurred at the edges. They could remember what they saw, but not precisely how they felt. They could recall its position, but not why they instinctively stepped back. This prompted small debates among researchers attempting to document the phenomenon scientifically. They wondered whether neutron radiation or some energetic emission affected their perception, making memories slippery like a wet glass surface. But even that explanation felt incomplete. Something subtler was at work, something that could not be captured in numbers or charts. Something that made the experience feel like a dream intact, yet impossible to articulate upon waking. That same night, one of the quietest researchers decided to stay longer than usual. He sat on a small chair in the corner of the room, watching the core from afar without writing anything. He was not conducting an experiment or collecting data. He simply wanted to observe the silence and let himself sink into the unusual atmosphere. In his stillness, he sensed that the core was not just an object. There was something in the way. It remained motionless, as if possessing its own rhythm. He felt no fear. In fact, he felt a strange comfort, as though accompanied by something neither benevolent nor malevolent, merely present. He watched the shadows surrounding it. They did not shift, they did not flicker. They simply existed as if time had stopped. When he finally rose to leave, he felt a faint sensation touch the deepest layer of his thoughts. A nudge that communicated nothing yet felt like a greeting from an unknown direction. He did not know whether it was imagination or exhaustion, but the experience left behind a gentle calm, as though the night itself had embraced the room. He turned off the light slowly and left with quiet steps, sensing that he had just witnessed something that could never repeat in the same way. The next morning, before the sun fully rose and before the sound of human activity returned to the laboratory corridors, the atmosphere inside the experiment room felt like a space holding its own breath. The first light entering through the window did not touch the core directly, but its presence slowly altered the color of the room, as if the light paused to consider whether it was safe to proceed. The early arriving researchers felt the air was slightly heavier than on previous days, though not in an unpleasant way. The heaviness brought an odd sense of stability, like an added layer that kept the small world around the core in balance. No one spoke upon entering, not due to rules, but because something within them felt that an early morning voice would disturb a structure forming quietly in the room. Approaching the table where the core rested, they noticed everything around it appeared tidier than before. Papers left the previous night lay unmoved, though the door should have created airflow each time it opened. A pencil that had been crooked now lay parallel to the table's edge, though none remembered adjusting it. One researcher suggested they might have done it unconsciously, but no one felt certain. The uncertainty brought no discomfort, instead adding another layer of quietness that made the room feel self-ordered in a slow, subtle manner. As they prepared the day's instruments, they noticed the gauge recording radiation fluctuations moved more smoothly than usual. No sudden spikes, no instability during warm-up. The needle seemed to follow a rhythm set by something beyond the machine, as if it knew when to adapt to the surrounding energy. The researchers refrained from commenting. They simply wrote numbers in a synchronized manner, sensing that observations were required but interpretations should wait. The scratch of pencils on paper became the room's only sound. Yet even that seemed softened, as if the room absorbed part of the vibration. One researcher stepped closer to the core and noticed the morning light reflected oddly from its surface. It did not sparkle or glimmer, but returned the light as a faint, mist-like sheen, visible only from a specific angle. The mist did not move, appearing instead like a delicate layer on perfectly calm water. The researcher stepped back and wrote the observation without comment. Unsure whether it was merely optical effect or something shifting within the object, something unrelated to heat or radiation, but to its still unknown nature. Minutes later, everyone felt a faint change not measurable by tools. The air warmed slightly, not in temperature, but in texture, creating the impression of a room breathing slowly like a living organism. The ceiling lights did not flicker, yet the illumination seemed more evenly distributed, making the room appear brighter despite no increase in intensity. The researchers stood in stillness, unsure if the change was real or perceptual, but all sensed it, enough to acknowledge something subtle was happening without presenting danger. A senior researcher approached with a distance measuring instrument and observed the needle moving faster than usual, as though responding to an unseen pattern. Yet it showed no instability. Its motion followed a mathematical regularity, unlike any previously recorded. He held his breath, not from fear, but from the feeling that getting too close might disrupt the pattern. When he stepped back, the needle slowed again, as if waiting. As they paused the session, the room returned to an even softer quietness. No tremors, no shifts, only a calm that felt like a morning half asleep. The researchers left with slow steps, carrying a growing but gentle curiosity. They did not yet know that these subtle shifts were only the beginning of greater changes in the days ahead, changes that would test not only their knowledge, but the limits of human perception before the boundary between science and mystery. core at a distance far wider than before, as if the laboratory had grown a new shape, forcing every person to maintain a safety boundary that was never truly safe. They no longer spoke about pride or achievement, because such words now sounded like fragile objects that would shatter at the slightest touch. Their thoughts were no longer on victory, but on the presence of something that should never have been awakened from its sleep. The small core looked calm, yet the calmness carried a signal like a whisper walking along the concrete walls without feet. The room temperature stayed stable, but there was a warm sensation coming not from the air, but from human awareness of an invisible danger, a sensation that made each breath move more carefully, as if even the lungs feared making a sound that might draw something out of the softly glowing core. They did not know whether the core was waiting or simply silent without intention. Yet in that silence, there was a psychological tremor, making them feel as though they were standing before something older than earthly science, something indifferent to human safety and uninterested in the boldness of curiosity. Some of them tried to soothe their mind by writing down new numbers, but the numbers jumped like shadows that had lost their shape, sometimes stable, sometimes rising, then falling without pattern, without purpose, without a message that could fit into human language, while others simply stared without staring, because focusing too long on the blue glow made the mind feel pulled into a strange quiet, as if the core spoke without sound, using a language without letters or pauses. They felt something difficult to explain, something not entirely from physics, but also not from imagination. For imagination can be controlled, yet this sensation moved on its own, forming a soft pressure behind the skull and near the chest, like a faint fear without cause. But still, they're uninvited. None of them mentioned the names Louis or Harry that night, because the names felt too heavy to hang in air already thick with memories they did not want to touch. They did not call the core a tool or a sample, because those words sounded too technical for something that could end human breath so easily. Thus the only word left was simply the core, a small word containing an entire destructibility hidden behind a soft glow. They knew history would call it by another name, yet that night they referred to it only as something silent, something waiting, something radiating. A feeling impossible to fully understand, a feeling that urged them to step back, yet also to understand further, a feeling that drew humans back to danger, because the desire to know was stronger than the fear of losing everything. And in that calm, no one knew whether the core watched them in return, or simply waited for a human hand to make another irreversible mistake. And that nighttime itself moved slowly, as if observing them back, and none dared to guess what the glowing object might be thinking, if it could think at all. In the early hours that felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, the researchers who still remained inside the building sensed that time no longer followed the hands of the clock, but instead followed the rhythm of their own breathing, stretching, and shrinking without any steady pattern. The laboratory that was usually filled with the hum of machines and measuring devices had become so silent they could hear the faint rustling of their own clothes. Each time they shifted slightly, the shadows on the walls appeared longer, as if trying to reach the blue glow that hovered over the small core, as though even the shadows wished to understand. What was unfolding, none of them dared to begin long conversations because every word felt like it might bounce back toward them with unknown consequences. So the only words spoken were short phrases, more like reminders to themselves than scientific discussions. Gradually they realized that the core no longer resembled an experimental object, but something akin to the center of an unusual stillness, a point where all sounds seemed to be drawn inward and disappear without return. The feeling made them stand stiffly, as though even the smallest movement could produce a wave that would disturb a delicate balance they could not comprehend despite their years of nuclear study that night. They felt like new students not yet permitted to understand even the simplest pages of the book, because what they sensed did not come from formulas, but from something older than formulas and quieter than empty space. Some of them glanced at the metal table, remembering the accidental screwdriver slipped months earlier, a sound that should have been ordinary, but instead turned life into history marked by loss. They recalled the tense faces of colleagues now gone, as though their shadows still stood in that room quietly, watching every movement without the ability to intervene. Those memories made the night feel long, as though the walls themselves had grown thicker, holding in every emotion, struggling to escape. Yet the tension did not arrive as a clear threat, but as a whisper that kept the body alert even when no danger was visible. Each small step in the room felt like a long journey into uncertainty, and every glance at the soft blue glow of the core made them question whether it was truly matter or whether humanity had accidentally created something capable of producing presence without form, a presence not born from sound or movement, but from the way space responded to it. The researchers did not call it a creature because that word carried too much imagination. They did not call it a machine because that was too narrow. They did not call it an anomaly because an anomaly could still be studied. They simply called it something because the word did not bind and did not promise false hope. Something could mean anything and also mean nothing at all. In that moment, they understood that their fear did not come from the core itself, but from the uncertainty about how much humanity could truly understand what it had made, because that night offered no answers, only a quiet that stretched slowly between the concrete walls that seemed to listen with patience. Something in the center of the room continued to glow softly, neither brighter nor dimmer, as though waiting for time itself to decide the direction of the next story no one there dared to predict. At the moment when the clock on the wall displayed numbers, they no longer cared about. The researchers began to sense that the air within the room was changing in a way that could not be clearly described, not a change visible to the eye like mist or smoke, but a change felt through their skin, like entering a room once inhabited by someone who has long departed, leaving behind only a faint trace of their presence. The temperature, according to the instruments, remained stable, yet their bodies felt a subtle shift, as though the air between them and the core had gained a new density, turning each breath slightly heavier. Though never painful, this sensation made them exchange glances without speaking, because none of them wished to be the first to admit that they sensed something not listed in any laboratory safety manual. They moved slowly, observing the circle of blue light that remained steady, yet appeared somehow deeper than before, as though the glow was not just a shimmer emerging from the metal surface, but a thin layer of space opening very slightly in front of them. Each small step brought a strange sensation along their spines, like something waiting to be understood but unwilling to introduce itself too soon, wanting only to remain quiet while humanity approached its limits. Some of them tried convincing themselves that all of this was simply the product of exhaustion, after long hours under pressure, that their minds were creating impressions that were not real yet when they closed their eyes briefly. They sensed something even clearer, a presence that did not move, but felt like a thin line crossing the room from the core, toward them, not an energy measured by instruments, but a form of attention without source or destination. They heard faint sounds from the measuring devices showing small, harmless fluctuations. But fluctuations that had never appeared before. The lines on the graph rose and dipped without pattern, as if the machine was following the breath of the room, not their breath and not any outside influence. The researchers looked at one another again, silently confirming that they all felt it, though none wished to say so aloud, because human voices felt too coarse to disturb such silence. In the corner of the room stood a table with old notes describing the past incident when the core nearly reached a critical point because of a small human mistake. And some of them glanced at that table, hoping to find some clue that this kind of silence had happened before, or whether this was entirely new, something unrecorded in any report so far. No document had ever described that a laboratory could feel like an ancient abandoned sanctuary. Yet that night, the room felt exactly like a space that held something, as if it had witnessed too many events and now simply sat thinking about them. The researchers slowly realized that what they faced was no longer a physical phenomenon, but a phenomenon of presence, and they stood within that uncertainty, sensing that the core was projecting something they could not identify, something not a message, but more like a conversation without words or direction. They listened with their bodies, not with their ears, waiting for the room to say something, though they knew the answer might never come. That night brought them to understand that there is a boundary between knowing and sensing, and that boundary felt very close, as if they could touch. If they dared to reach out. In the end, they remained silent, watching the blue glow that seemed to watch them back without intention, a presence that had no name, something that required time to understand, or perhaps was never meant to be understood at all. When the night had fully settled and the entire laboratory building lay in a quietness they had never truly acknowledged, the researchers began to sense that the presence of the core was no longer merely that of an object in a long-running experiment, but something that emitted a form of existence impossible to chart in diagrams or equations. They stood in a circle of silence that grew denser around them, and felt that the space itself was adjusting to a rhythm not born of external forces, but of the core resting at the center with a blue glow that did not flicker, though it seemed to deepen whenever the angle of human observation shifted. Some of them closed their eyes, briefly searching for mental grounding to understand the subtle sensation flowing from the core. Yet what they found instead were faint images like landscapes they had never seen, with colors too gentle to be named, and shapes that did not obey geometry. They opened their eyes, again realizing that the images were not hallucinations, but reflections of something the core held within, as though it carried layers of memory not arranged in human time, but in a kind of experience needing no years or events as markers. Some of the scientists attempted to speak to one another, but their voices felt too loud, too intrusive within the shifting room, and they instinctively returned to silence, letting its strange comfort settle over them, because the quiet felt protective, as though the room did not wish to harm them, but merely to be understood at its own boundary. Those who stood closest to the core described that the blue glow now resembled a thin surface that did not radiate energy but seemed instead to be holding its breath, waiting for something even the core itself had not decided. Others observed the fluctuating graphs on the monitors rising and falling without pattern, yet remaining within safe limits. But the pattern had a pulse that reminded them of the deep, slow rhythm heard in old caves where water drips, forming a sound not meant for listening, yet present, because the ancient world needed something other than absolute silence. One researcher recalled a report from the previous year when a colleague had felt a similar sensation before the core emitted a non-lethal flash of blue light that created the impression that the world paused for an instant. But that report never mentioned the feeling of presence that filled the room tonight, a presence closer to something that had existed before humanity assigned names to natural forces. As they examined the room more closely, they observed how the core's light reflected on metal surfaces, on glass, on instruments, on their own hands, and realized the reflections did not behave as expected. They did not bend in straight, predictable lines, but shifted like water, following an invisible current, aligned with something rotating. Discovery did not frighten them, but deepened their understanding that the core was communicating in a language that could not be translated into human concepts. Amidst all of this, they felt a delicate vibration beneath their feet, not from a machine, not from wind, not from human motion, but from the very center, as if the core were speaking to the structure of the building, and the structure replied with a resonance so faint only the human body could detect it, not the instruments. They stood motionless, letting their bodies listen to the rhythm like listeners at the end of a long concert, sensing the last note drifting without sound, human. And finally, all their attention focused on the core, which no longer seemed to shine but to rest with a profound presence, one that made no demands, posed no threats, but called to them so gently they could not tell whether it was a request or merely a reflection of something long shaped by human hands. That night they realized that nothing they had studied had prepared them for this form of interaction, one without language, purpose, or origin, an interaction that could only be felt and never fully explained. As the hours continued moving toward the point where the night became so silent that even the faintest vibration felt like part of the Earth's breath, the researchers realized that the changes they had observed around the core were beginning to spread toward areas of the room that had previously remained unresponsive. They noticed that the air near the back wall seemed layered, though the layers were not visible to the eye, but could be sensed through shifting pressure flowing slowly across their bodies like a soft current that did not move in one direction, but circled the room in a vast loop. This pattern felt like a rhythm the core was attempting to imprint onto the structure of the room, as though mapping the physical space into something more flexible, more resonant, and more able to accommodate forms of existence that did not obey ordinary three-dimensional logic. Several researchers felt as if the floor softened beneath their feet, not sinking or moving, but loosening like earth after the first rain following a long drought. Yet the softening was not physical, but present as a sensation perceivable only when they stood perfectly still, allowing their bodies to detect the faintest vibrations tied to the center of the room. They remained silent, attempting to determine whether this phenomenon was a mesocles. Was a mesocles? Was a mesocles? Was a mesocles? We said this softening was not basically besive. My music, my musisk. My mesocles, who messive. My mesocles, my mesocles. I coincide. We said, by weak and mind, my mesclalard, by my musiket, by I lead sald, Knesset, cannot consist it, slee me it, so we rig can sit to be say so like we sick it lie to sit to kike it could be it I the code say I did test to cursed to state to the ritz the we get unseparate it's to where thus the basis. Defensive reaction from the core, or a natural evolution of its interaction, because in all the years of studies, there had never been any record of the core showing the ability to shape spatial patterns or synchronize with the entire environment. Some began considering the possibility that the core held a structure more complex than unstable plutonium. MASS perhaps containing information embedded in the interaction of its particles, information formed in earlier experiments that were never documented or perhaps imprinted during its creation under immense pressure and historical uncertainty. Whenever they gazed into the gentle blue glow, they felt that the light was no longer merely radiation, but part of a communication passing through the particles of the surrounding space. Communication requiring no symbols, no sound, no vocabulary, only subtle vibrations. Carried through the structure of the building, the entire room now seemed to follow a rhythm emerging from its center, not biological, not mechanical, but something like a slow movement of an entity developing awareness. This initially led some researchers to suspect psychological effects, but when one of them turned off a nearby device, they discovered the rhythm persisted unaffected, proving that what they sensed came from the core itself. They examined a wave instrument in the corner and saw the lines forming loops repeating every few seconds, imperfect but familiar, like the early stages of synchronization between two elements adjusting within a larger system. Some researchers sensitive to temperature shifts noticed small warm spots appearing across the room, not strong enough to raise the overall temperature, but present like distant heat sources several meters away, and these warm spots moved, following the core's gentle pulsations, as though new patterns were forming across the room. These subtle shifts were not frightening. Instead, they created an odd comfort, like watching something grow slowly, without urgency, or threat, without demanding interpretation, yet drawing human attention because humans cannot ignore even the smallest movement when it comes from something they believed they controlled, but never truly did. Some of them closed their eyes and detected layered rhythms, not a single pulse, but multiple pulses, stacked like echoes arriving from afar, but gradually settling within the room and brushing against their bodies. These were not sounds, not device-generated vibrations, but something resembling a proto-language before language existed, requiring no symbols, no intermediaries, only the presence of humans to be perceived, not understood fully. That night, the researchers felt they were witnessing one of the rarest phases of the core, something that perhaps had never been recorded because it manifested only when the room was perfectly quiet and humans were calm enough to notice its existence. As time drifted deeper into the night and the air inside the laboratory grew softer and heavier, like a thin blanket covering the researchers began to realize that the ongoing changes were no longer confined to their physical surroundings, but slowly extending into the way they perceived their own presence. It felt as though the boundary between their bodies and the room around them was dissolving, not in a frightening way, but in a way that created a heightened sense of awareness. They stood in a silent circle, sensing that the subtle pulse from the core now moved not only through the floor or the walls, but through them, as though the human body was just another small part of an expanding landscape of energy, arranging itself without intention, without threats, and without any aim other than existing in a state no one had ever fully understood since the early days of research. Some researchers lifted their hands slowly, trying to feel the waves moving through the air, not as an experiment, but as a natural response to a phenomenon so gentle it could not be forced into any theoretical frame. Their hands felt cool yet weightless, as though the air carried tiny particles invisible to the eye, but tactile in their movement across the skin, following the same rhythm as the pulsing blue light from the core. They remembered old accounts from the earliest scientists who had worked with the core, accounts that had never been included in official documents because they were considered too subjective and unscientific accounts describing sensations that only arose at night when the room was perfectly silent and nothing remained but the sound of slow human breathing. They began to understand that nights like this might be the same conditions those early researchers had experienced long before modern safety protocols, long before clearer scientific understanding, at a time when instinct played a much larger role in determining whether something was safe or dangerous. The longer they observed the blue light, the more they sensed that the core was no longer a glowing mass, but the center of a slowly shifting spatial rhythm, like an organism trying to remember its original form, perhaps a form lost when it was cut, shaped, assembled, and forced into an experiment it never understood. Some researchers recalled the tragic events from many years before, when the core emitted a sudden bright blue glow and a colleague lost his life within days. But what they felt tonight was entirely different. No threat, no danger, no pressure leading to harm. Instead, everything suggested a very old phase, as though the core was revealing a pattern formed long before those incidents, perhaps a trace of its earliest internal state when it was created under immense pressure and extreme temperature conditions inherent to nuclear material production. They noticed that the blue glow no longer only radiated outward, but also seemed to draw inward, like a slow breath, forming a rhythm that was not biological, yet still recognizable. After standing still long enough, they began to hear something, not a sound, not a vibration, not a machine-driven frequency, but a kind of whisper without source or direction, filling the room. Like a thin mist spreading across every surface, a whisper with no words and no message, but a presence so steady they realized what was happening tonight was no longer related to radiation or particle physics, but something far more delicate and far older than human scientific understanding, as though the core was remembering something that could never be expressed in any theory. Some researchers close their eyes, fully letting their bodies act as instruments far more sensitive than the machines placed throughout the room. And they realized the shifts occurring were not just expanding patterns, but patterns returning to their center as though the room itself was breathing. With the core slowly in, slowly out, continuous and unbroken, everything they felt that night had no direction, no purpose, no message, but still carried meaning in a form so soft that none of them tried to resist it. Because they understood that whatever form of existence was peering could only be witnessed, not controlled, and never explained. As the night grew older and the soft light from the core continued to flow gently like a pulse that never ceased, the researchers in the room began to understand that they had entered a phase of observation entirely different from what they had ever anticipated. It felt as though the room had shifted into a state where time no longer moved in its ordinary way, and each second felt stretched rather than flowing. They remained still, not out of fear, but because they sensed that every small motion might disturb the forming pattern, a pattern that could not be explained with numbers or equations, yet held a presence so strong that all of them could feel it without speaking. One thing slowly became clear to them. The phenomenon unfolding before their eyes was not the result of a mistake, nor of human negligence, but something that had been embedded within the core from the very beginning of its creation. As though the core carried a memory far older than any laboratory it had been kept in, far older than any human who had ever touched it, and far older than any theory attempting to explain its nature. The researchers noticed how the blue light now resembled fine strands gently intertwining, forming slow movements like calm ocean currents, currents without waves, but moving in circular patterns that repeated endlessly. Some of them felt that the changes were arising not only from the core, but also from the space around them, as though the walls surrounding the laboratory were breathing with the same rhythm as the flowing light. It sounded strange, but caused no fear. Instead, it brought a sensation of ancient stillness, as if they were standing in a place that had witnessed countless events, yet chose to remain quiet without leaving any visible trace. Some researchers closed their eyes to feel the changes more deeply, and they realized that what they sensed was not sound, not vibration, nor electromagnetic signals, but a subtle movement responding to human presence itself, as though the core acknowledged them not as individuals, but as a collective witnessing a cycle that was slowly returning to its origin. A cycle that might have existed long before humans understood neutron reactivity and material structure. The oldest researcher among them recalled an old account written by one of the early scientists. A document never shared widely because it was considered unscientific and too mystical for modern research. It described a silent night when the core displayed an inexplicable pattern, and the observer sensed that something was trying to communicate, not with language, but with a harmony not bound to any form. Tonight seemed to repeat what happened decades ago, only now the researchers experienced it with a gentler understanding. That perhaps not all phenomena require scientific explanation to be accepted. Some of them began to feel that the room now had a different gravitational center, as though everything was slowly being drawn toward the core. Not by force, but by presence, a continuous presence, giving the sensation of standing in a place that no longer required physical boundaries. Even though they stood at a distance, they still felt that subtle pull, like the movement of water around a person's feet at the shore, except this current did not come from outside, but from the glowing center in the room. They observed their shadows softening, as if partially absorbed by the blue light. And though physics might explain parts of the phenomenon, there remained a portion beyond anyone's understanding, a portion that made them realize that the core may never have been truly passive, but had been waiting for certain conditions to reveal patterns not visible in ordinary experimental settings. The longer they watched, the more they understood that this night was an extremely rare phase, one that might not repeat even with meticulously replicated experiments because the phenomenon did not follow theory or procedure, but a rhythm of nature that humans could never fully parse. The researchers stood for a long time, sensing that the pattern was slowly moving toward its innermost point, as though whatever was happening was approaching its peak, not through an outburst, not through an increase in energy, but through a deepening that strengthens silently expanding. Through each of their minds, in the end, they realized that the core was not displaying power or danger, but revealing memories that belonged to no one in the room. Memories visible only when the world reached its most silent state. When the pattern reached its deepest point, and the room began to feel like a vessel that held not only light, but something far more delicate, the researchers slowly realized that whatever they were witnessing was no longer a physical event that could be measured with the instruments they had prepared earlier in the evening. It felt as though every device placed in the corners of the room had become silent objects, incapable of detecting the movement or rhythm forming before their eyes. They understood that the core had entered a state so rare it might never have been recorded in its entire history. They watched as the blue light began to move differently, no longer flowing outward or inward as before, but forming a large circle, not clearly visible, yet perceptible as a gentle motion orbiting the room in a steady rhythm. Some researchers lifted their heads, sensing that the air now carried a shifting weight, as though the room itself had become part of something larger than the laboratory, a space without edges or direction, yet fully shaped by the same rhythm emanating from the core. There was a sensation of standing between two worlds that did not collide, but passed through one another without sound or tension. Some researchers began to sense a presence, not as a being, not as a message, but as an awareness without form and without intention, other than appearing as part of the pattern unfolding that night. They did not know whether the presence came from the core, from the room, from the merging of both, or from the way humans responded to something beyond explanation. Yet whatever its origin, the researchers felt no threat. Instead, there was a deep calm, a calm that felt ancient, as if from a time when the world moved on its own rhythms, long before machines and theories existed, as if nature still expressed itself without interruption or interpretation. The researchers began to understand that the core may never have been truly silent. Perhaps it had only been waiting for a moment when everything around it was quiet enough and humans nearby were able to witness not only with sight, but with a wider awareness. Some researchers who closed their eyes reported that the light did not appear simply as color, but as movement forming circles within circles, patterns that crossed and folded like a map, describing something without shape, yet still possessing structure. They sensed that the core was gradually revealing layers never shown before. Layers not expressing power or danger, but what might be its deepest memory. A memory that could not be translated into human language or physical equations. Though they could not interpret the pattern, they understood it was not random and not accidental, but something returning to an original form, perhaps a form it held before human hands shaped it into an instrument of experimentation. Some researchers noticed that the room had become completely silent, though their bodies breathed, though the machines continued to run. No sound reached their ears. As if every vibration was absorbed by an unseen layer covering the room, transforming it into a space without echoes, without interruption, without beginning, and without end. They stood in this total stillness, knowing that what was happening was not a phase to be solved, but a phase to be allowed to unfold without interference. They were witnesses standing in a place that felt exceedingly old, a place that might appear only once in a human lifetime. And they felt the core was not showing power, but recalling something deeper than time itself. A memory that could never be stored by instruments or captured in words, but only witnessed in absolute silence. At the moment, the silence reached a point at which none of them could distinguish whether they were listening to the outside world or simply to the quiet echo of their own bodies. The researchers slowly sensed that something in the room had begun to shift the way space held its shape. It felt as though the world around them no longer relied on walls, floors, or ceilings, but on the pattern radiating from the core, which now appeared not merely as the physical center of the room, but as the single point toward which all awareness was gently drawn without force and without pressure. They observed the blue light extending in a way unlike ordinary illumination, not radiating outward, not expanding, but moving like a transparent thread drifting through water, forming an unbroken line that also did not choose a clear direction. That line looped gently through the air, and with prolonged observation, it appeared to divide into two, then merge again, following a rhythm older than modern physics. Some researchers standing closer felt a lightness in their chest, as though they were standing at the edge of a place with no depth, yet slowly moving inward into them, creating the sense that they were not entering something, but being invited to recognize a pattern that had always been present. But invisible to human perception, they noticed that the room itself seemed to take on a new form, a form not relying on the usual dimensions used to measure length or width. Instead, the space appeared to expand and contract simultaneously, something impossible, yet so soft that no discomfort arose. Rather, the shift felt as if the room was quietly adjusting to the presence of each person, not to confine them, but to allow them to experience the emerging pattern without fear. Some researchers waved their hands gently through the air, noticing that their movements brushed against an unseen layer, a layer with no temperature and no texture, yet carrying the subtle impression that the air now possessed a structure of its own, a structure undetectable. Earlier, the layer did not resist their hands, yet returned their presence in a delicate way, as though the air mirrored them more sensitively than their senses could perceive, unless they were absolutely still. They realized this layer might be part of the pattern released by the core. K pattern, not made of light alone, not a vibration alone, but a kind of structure flowing through the room without altering physical objects, yet altering human perception. Several researchers began noticing that time also felt different, not faster, not slower, but lacking sequence. They could no longer tell how long they had been standing. A minute felt like an hour like a single long breath, yet without confusion, simply the sense that time had folded into itself, shaping the room with the same slow rhythm as the blue glow. Some of those more sensitive felt a vibration not from the floor, but from a point they could not physically indicate, as though the vibration came from the space between objects, a pulse reminiscent of distant footsteps in the earliest nights of the world. Before buildings and machines existed, they recognized that what they were witnessing was not a scientific manifestation of energy, but something more like a process, occurring when something attempts to recall its original form, a form untouched by human use or modern definitions of physics, and slowly they began to understand that the core, though shaped by human hands, might possess layers untouched by any tool or experiment, layers that boring could only open when humans were present in complete stillness, without ambition, without the pressure to find answers. Some researchers took slow breaths, not for calm, but as a way to acknowledge that something subtle was unfolding, something that did not need to be explained, recorded, or included in any official report, because whatever occurred in that room tonight could only be described as a presence forming gently through light, through rhythm, and through awareness, dissolving into a space. With no boundaries, they remained motionless, and in that stillness, they realized that the core was revealing an extraordinarily deep layer, one without shape, but with meaning that could only be felt, never understood. In the thickening silence of the laboratory room, now inhabited only by the shadows of equipment that no longer worked with the same rhythm as in the earliest days of experimentation, the technicians on night duty often said they felt something that was difficult to describe, as if a slow pulse emerged from the silent metal core, a pulse that made no sound yet felt through the air, like a faint wave touching the skin without ever truly making contact. And although they never spoke of it openly, they all knew such feelings could never be included in official reports meant to record only heat measurements, or changes in radiation, or the position of neutron reflectors. Yet everyone who stood watch around the object sensed the same presence, something that existed without form, without sound, without direction. And in the long quiet of the night, they sometimes said to themselves that perhaps the core remembered something. Perhaps it held some echo of every hand that had approached it, every mistake made near it, every second of human bravery mixed with excessive carelessness. And although no evidence could support such an idea, the feeling persisted that the core held something unfinished, as if it guarded a record that had never been opened. A record written in a language no human could understand, yet still leaving the impression that its contents were never lost, merely waiting to be revealed at a moment never planned. Those long nights allowed the human mind to wander farther than permitted by the strict routines of science, and in the half-exhausted state of those working there, the room sometimes seemed to expand beyond its physical size, stretching into the dark corners unreachable by any lamp, a space that appeared to store everything that had occurred beneath the blue glow that once emerged from a dangerous reaction no one could tame, A light remembered clearly because they knew it was not born from something gentle or familiar, but from a state too close to the boundary of safety, too close to the point where everything might change in an instant. And in their collective memory, that blue glow became a symbol of what had nearly brought greater destruction. A reminder of the arrogance of humans who believed they could control every particle dancing. At the edge of uncertainty amid all these thoughts, there was also a soft feeling that did not clash with fear, but surrounded it. A feeling that whatever was unfolding there was not only an encounter between humans and physical matter, but also between humans and their own history. A history of ambition, discovery, failure, unanswered questions, and mysteries that did not need answers to justify their existence. And that feeling sometimes became their reason to remain calm even while working near something that could change everything with a single mistake. For in that calm, they sensed that the core might be silent, not because it lacked meaning, but because it possessed meanings too large to be described. Meanings felt only through long, quiet, and the respectful distance they kept and throughout those nights. None of the technicians were truly certain whether what they felt was the result of fatigue or the presence of an unexplained phenomenon. Yet they continued their work with the same rhythm, the same careful pace, and the same deliberate thoughts. As if the presence of the mystery was not a threat, but a quiet reminder of boundaries that must not be crossed. And they kept those feelings in a place never written down, a place existing only in their memories, stored as quietly as the core itself, which stood motionless without revealing whether it was sleeping or simply waiting for someone to try to understand what it held deep within. As time moved further beyond the deepest point of the night, and the air inside the laboratory became so quiet that even the smallest motion seemed to alter the silence itself, the researchers began to sense that whatever was happening around the core was no longer something they could separate from themselves. The subtle rhythm spreading from the center of the room had aligned with their presence, not as a reaction, but as part of a larger pattern that included them without distinguishing human from room or room from core. They stood in a silence that deepened with every passing minute and saw that every element around them began to show changes too small to perceive directly, yet consistent enough to be felt as a passive adaptation to the presence of the core. Even the air they breathed seemed to shift into something softer and denser, like a transparent layer, keeping the room connected in a stable rhythm. Some researchers stepped closer, some remained still, but all of them sensed that the space now had a different depth. A depth not tied to physical measurement, but to the way the room stored traces of every movement of light and energy passing within it. They saw that the blue light moving in and out of the core was no longer linear. Its flow resembled a pattern, attempting to recall a shape unknown to them, yet somehow familiar, as though the core was restoring something lost before humans cut it into measurable components. The researchers checked their instruments again, realizing that most readings were no longer comprehensible within the framework of standard physics. The numbers shifted in slow rhythms detached from causality, rising and falling without mathematical patterns, yet maintaining an order that could be sensed, though not calculated. This helped them understand that the core might be entering a phase of communication. entirely unlike any radiative or resonant behavior they had studied before. Some attempted to speak softly, but each word felt like an unnecessary disturbance because the room no longer received sound in the same way. Their voices did not echo, did not travel, and did not scatter, but faded instantly, as though the night itself would accept only silence, while anything louder dissolved before reaching the walls. At that moment, the researchers realized the interaction was no longer about how humans understood the core, but about how the core accepted the presence of humans in its simplest form, not through words, not through concepts, but through the mere fact of their existence, standing, listening, and experiencing the same rhythm moving slowly through their bodies. They noticed the shifting shadows on the floor and walls, shadows not following the direction of the light, but moving like lines formed by water adjusting to unseen currents. The shadows drifted without pattern, yet always returned to certain positions, as though the room and the core were seeking a state of balance, long forgotten, but re-emerging that night. They felt no fear, despite the complexity and incomprehensibility of the changes, because the patterns appeared too calm and too consistent to be threats. Instead, they sensed a presence so old, so gentle, and so stable that none of them felt the need to retreat or resist. Some closed their eyes for a moment, sensing whether their bodies had changed, and found that their breaths now followed the same rhythm as the blue light breaths that moved in slowly and out slowly with a small pause. That felt not biological, but like a space between two stabilizing forms of energy. They realized the room was not merely responding passively, but resonating with the core in a conversation without sound. A conversation never intended for humans, yet observable by humans when the conditions of the night aligned long enough. They understood that the core had never been silent even when their instruments detected no activity, because the long stillness they felt came not from absence but from activity too soft for machines and perceptible only to the human body under specific conditions. They sensed the core reorganizing itself, not to change, but to remember the balance it once had before humans placed it in research programs. Before machines analyzed its structure, before theories attempted to constrain its behavior. Amid all this, one researcher noted that the room's temperature shifted gradually with no intention to warm or cool, but adjusting so subtly it could not be a physical reaction, but rather the space accommodating the new rhythm created by the core. Slowly, they felt a small recurring vibration beneath their ribs, a vibration not from medical equipment or acoustic waves, but a form of internal resonance arising as their bodies aligned with the stable external pattern. At that moment, they understood they were not witnessing a physical phenomenon, but a form of existence emerging when something long held in imbalance began to find its center again. And they realized that night, they were not observing change, but alignment. Something so old, so calm, and so complete that it required no meaning, no purpose, and no explanation. As the minutes slipped further into the part of night that no longer had a clear shape, and the laboratory felt like a space detached from time, the researchers began to understand that whatever was occurring between the core and the room had reached a point that could not be called a beginning or an end. Everything felt as though it was contained in a single movement, looping slowly, with no identifiable purpose, yet maintaining enough stability to feel alive in a manner that resembled neither an organism nor a simple physical object. They stood in a circle that felt calmer than before, not because they understood what was happening, but because what was happening no longer demanded understanding from them. The silence filling the room, like a thin mist, now had a texture almost perceptible, as though the air had formed small structures recognizable only by the human body and not by any sensor. Some researchers noticed that the rhythm, which had previously spread outward, now felt more centered, no longer dispersing in long patterns, but returning to the core like a tide searching for its oldest and quietest equilibrium. They saw that the blue color radiating from the core no longer appeared entirely blue, but carried a soft layer, shifting like a gradient between light and shadow, as though the core was adjusting its intensity to the room's new rhythm. At that moment, they realized that the light from the core was not merely illumination, but a form of movement, inseparable from the space itself. They observed the floor, walls, and instruments reflecting the light, and saw those reflections moving not according to angle or distance, but according to the presence of the humans standing around it. The reflections followed them like a slow current, as though the room acknowledged their existence as part of the pattern rather than external observers. One researcher raised a hand slowly and saw the shadow distort in a harmless pattern that revealed subtle repositioning within the structure of light and space. Repositioning too slight to be called a change, yet consistent enough to feel like an adjustment that had begun long before humans entered the room. The longer they watched, the clearer it became that the core was not transforming, but retrieving something fundamental, perhaps something that existed before it was cut, transported, stored, and tested. They began to understand that the core had never been reacting to human experiments in the way they assumed. Instead, it had always shown its intrinsic pattern only when environmental conditions reached a certain point. Tonight appeared to be that point, because everything they witnessed moved in a rhythm unlike anything they had encountered, not chaotic, but so calm it barely felt like change at all. Some took deeper breaths to sense whether the air had changed chemically. But what they felt was not a shift in composition, but a shift in how the room responded to their presence. Their breaths were no longer simply biological motions, but small waves that joined the room's energy pattern, each inhalation bringing in a thin layer of silence, and each exhalation releasing a part of it back, as though their bodies were flowing in the same continuity as the core and the space. Those standing closest to the core saw that the blue light now moved more slowly, not because it weakened, but because its rhythm had found a more stable shape. They understood the core was no longer a glowing mass, but a center directing how energy in the room expanded, contracted, and returned to itself without creating tension. They felt a soft vibration across the floor, a vibration without direction or pattern, yet consistent enough to suggest the building itself was aligning its inner structure with the core. This vibration could not be detected by instruments, only through the bones of their feet and chest, as though their bodies were the most sensitive receivers of silent change. One researcher closed his eyes, fully listening to the room, and sensed something that was not sound, not pressure, and not frequency. but a presence settling slowly into a quieter form, a form that needed no scientific definition and required no interpretation, only acknowledgement. Some of them began to understand that this night was not about experiments, not about data, and not about observable physical phenomena, but about how an object held in imbalance for so long finally began to find its center again, returning to a pattern too subtle to be measured yet strong enough to shift how humans felt their own existence. They realized the core was not attempting to communicate, signal, or reveal anomalous behavior. It was simply returning to a basic form long hidden beneath layers of human analysis. At that moment, the researchers understood that whatever they witnessed might never be explained, and did not need to be explained because its existence was not dependent on human comprehension, but on an ancient rhythm that emerged only when the night became perfectly quiet, when the room achieved full balance, and when the core ceased to be an experiment and returned to being itself. As the night deepened and the blue glow of the core subsided into an almost imperceptible pulse, the researchers realized that the core was no longer merely an object within an experiment, but a center weaving subtle connections between space, time, and human consciousness around it. They stood silently, observing how the energy emitted by the core permeated the entire laboratory, as if every instrument, wall, floor, and even the air itself had become part of an unseen network, yet tangible in sensation. Every breath became part of the rhythm. Every movement of eyes, hands, and feet adjusted to the delicate pulse that could not be controlled or stopped by humans, but only accepted and felt. They began to understand that what they were witnessing that night was not a phenomenon measurable by any instrument, but an existential experience combining perception of space, perception of time, and perception of self into an inseparable unity. The layer of blue light that once appeared solid now transformed into a medium that penetrated the surrounding space, creating illusions of depth and distance that did not exist in the physical world. They sensed that the core did not merely emit energy, but reminded them of something long lost from human comprehension, something connected to the origins of matter and fundamental experiences preceding language and mathematical calculation. Some researchers closed their eyes fully to capture the sensation more purely, without visual distractions, and they felt a soft vibration from the core reaching to the marrow of their bones, as if the core possessed its own consciousness, aware of human limits and adjusting its intensity to remain within the body's comfort while still compelling a deeper awareness of their own existence. They noticed that each change in light and energy followed a pattern that was non-repetitive, yet harmonious. There was no chaos, only unconventional balance. They began to understand that the core was not an entity waiting for something, but present in every moment, subtly yet consistently marking the boundary between the physical world and a metaphysical experience. They observed that any sounds normally heard in the laboratory were now irrelevant. The hum of machines, instruments, even human breaths were subdued by a larger rhythm, emanating from the core, as though the laboratory had become a field enveloped in a gentle resonance linking everything to its center. Some felt a sensation akin to lucid dreaming, seeing their own shadows merge with surrounding objects, forming patterns difficult to describe, yet internally coherent. They realized that this night represented a meeting between human consciousness and a form of existence older than themselves, wider than the laboratory space and more fundamental than any experiment ever conducted. The experience required no interaction, no alteration. Mere presence and observation constituted the purest form of participation. Each researcher felt the boundary between self and environment blur as their consciousness expanded within the energy field created by the core. That consciousness offered no explanations, no messages that could be translated, but merely affirmed its existence through subtle phenomena perceived by body and mind. The core did not limit this experience to a single individual, but invited all present to align with a rhythm older and deeper than time and space. They began to comprehend that what occurred that night was not an experiment, but a collective observation of the interaction between human awareness and the core itself, and interaction without words, purpose, or bounds, yet carrying profound meaning and leaving an imprint, both emotional and physical. That night ended not with experimental closure or scientific reporting, but with the awareness that the core had revealed its deepest layer. Something perhaps never expressible by science, but perceivable by every observer in silent presence. They left the laboratory with a quiet unlike before, an understanding that whatever they experienced that night was a meeting with something far older than themselves, broader than human comprehension, and remaining a mystery that would follow them in every heartbeat. From that night on, they knew the core was not merely experimental material, but an entity awaiting observation and respect in silence, like an ancient story whispering softly through layers of time and space. As the night shifted toward dawn and the laboratory remained enveloped in dense silence, the researchers realized that the night had been more than a scientific experience. It had been a kind of real-world bedtime story, a tale without a definite ending, yet leaving a gentle trace in their consciousness. They stood among the instruments and the core, which now appeared calmer than before. The blue light that had previously pulsed had returned to an almost static state, as if the core were resting after weaving the delicate network connecting human existence, space, and time. Their awareness slowly seeped back into their bodies. It carried a newly born sense of connection, the understanding that they were not merely observers, but part of something larger, moving far slower and older than human calculation. They walked slowly toward the laboratory exit, feeling each step merge with residual ripples of energy still present in the air. Their shadows on the floor seemed to stretch, following an unseen rhythm felt in their bodies, like an echo of the night that had just passed. They paused briefly to glance back at the core, sensing a depth that could not be scientifically explained, yet remained imprinted on their hearts. The silence of the night left a warm and slightly melancholic feeling, a reminder that some phenomena in the world cannot be controlled, need not be controlled. It is enough to simply be still and observe with care and respect. They understood that the core was not a lifeless object or experimental tool, but an entity teaching that within silence there are lessons about existence that do not depend on human comprehension. They stepped out of the laboratory, taking deep breaths, bringing back to the real world something immeasurable yet perceptible as a profound calm. The awareness that they had witnessed something older and vaster than time remained within their bodies, each inhale a subtle reminder that the night had opened a small window into a mystery that could never be fully explained, yet could be accepted as part of a larger reality. They closed the laboratory door and walked into the still, dark street, feeling the morning air creeping into their lungs, yet carrying traces of the core's gentle vibration, like a soft shadow demanding no attention but remaining present. They exchanged quiet glances with fellow researchers' smiles as faint as the blue light, now much calmer. And in their hearts grew the understanding that the night had marked an encounter between humanity and something older than history, something that remained a mystery, leaving awe and tranquility. The night ended like a bedtime story, leaving a melancholic yet comforting feeling. A story of a glowing core and the silence weaving connections between space, time, and human consciousness, a story they would remember throughout their lives without fully comprehending. It is enough to simply feel and cherish as an invaluable experience.